I wanted to know really how compelling can it be and how compelling do we find narrative?
Mhm. Very good. Well, the philosopher Hannah Arendt said, if somebody asks you who you are, you tell your story. And what she's getting at there is a basic human fact that we are the story that we have given to ourselves and that has been given to us. As I think it was Proust, the French modernist writer, put it, we are a tapestry of stories woven and unwoven. Um, so this idea that we are made up of our narrative doesn't just mean we're fiction, we just imagine who we are. To actually tell your story is to tell not just your future possibilities, that could be arguably fantasy, fiction, projection, all from your mind, but it's also a retelling, a recasting, a refiguring of your past life. And your past life is not, for the most part, something you chose. It is something given. As the existentialists would say, we're thrown into a world. That's our history, that's our past, that's our heritage. It's given to us. And yet we can project or reproject ourselves in terms of our future possibilities. Now, that activity, that function of refiguring our past in the present moment as we pro figure, so to speak, um, and project our future is the act of narrative. And that's why narrative is temporal. Paul Ricoeur, my mentor in Paris, French philosopher, wrote 3 volumes called Time and Narrative. And narrative is fundamentally linked to the temporality of our lives. One of the founders of modern hermeneutics was hermeneutic philosophy was William Dilthey, and he had a wonderful phrase in German called Zusammenhalt, Zusammenhalt, and he said our history, be it personal or collective, because the collective is also narrative. Nations, tell stories to themselves about who they are in order to explain themselves to themselves and to others. It's not just human individuals; it's also collectivities, communities, states, nations, tribes, whatever, who retell the story of themselves. So Zusammenhang des Lebens, wonderful phrase in German, means the hanging together, the stitching together of a life. And that's what we do. Life is not just pure instinct or pure biology. It's also turning our given zoological life into a biography. Or again, to come back to Hannah Arendt, it's turning our zoe, our life as a physical entity, a life force, into bios in Greek, and bios includes autobiography, biography, collective biography. And that's very important. That's what narrative does. It turns our zoology into a biography, so to speak.
That point on a narrative sort of being, or rather the base for narrative being given to us was really interesting because I remember within your book there was an insistence on narrative being given to us by the gods, and forgive me if I'm phrasing this wrong, but given to us by the gods, but it's narrated with a yarn that's spun by human hands. So it's, every time it's told, it's a different story with a certain flair and a certain pizzazz of each person. And every time it's recounted, it's told in a manner that could be seen as flawed or could also be seen as sort of the enactment of either the person or the group's understanding of themselves into the act of retelling the story. And I guess the question that I'm sort of getting to here is, I would love to unpack and understand what it means to feel like a narrative is being given to you, and how that changes when either person. I know there's a distinction here between the individual and the group, and I'd love to get to that. But what's the difference between a narrative being given to you and then the recountment of that as an individual or as a society? How does that sort of delineation come about?
Yes, great question. Well, to come back to that line about, the gods giving us stories that we can then tell and retell infinitely again and again, that's actually from Arundhati Roy, the wonderful contemporary Indian writer, novelist, The God of Small Things, The God of Little Things, perhaps, is the title of her novel. But in that, her point is that, for centuries, for millennia, people, if they were asked who they are, the meaning of their lives, the purpose of their existence, would generally begin by invoking the gods. Well, the gods made us like this. Yahweh created the world like this. Zeus and what have you, Gaia and Uranus, had this drama and that produced me. So by turning the beginning of our lives, the origin of our being, our cosmogenesis and the origin of the world, the theogenesis, the origin of the gods, into a myth, a mythos. A mythos in Greek means a plot. It means a narrative. So mythologies are basically saying we come from stories and we attribute to them a divine quality because we pay honor and obeisance in some way to our ancestors. And we consider them sacred. So it's not just anybody's story that they just make up out of a whim or a personal whatever act of will. It's something laid down from the beginning of time, in illo tempore. That's how the myths used to start. In Irish, we would say in Gaelic, fado, fado, a long time ago. Such a god, such a sacred hero, whatever. Acted in such a way, and this gave rise to our world, and that world gave rise to my ancestors, and my ancestors gave rise to me. So we come from these sacred stories, these mythoi, these myths, mythologies, and that actually gives us a certain liberty to actually interpret and reinterpret the stories of the gods. I mean, at one level they have an authority, but another level, well, the gods speak in multiple ways. For the Greeks, look at Delphi, the oracles, Cassandra, Tiresias, they all interpret the meaning of the gods in different ways. In the Abrahamic tradition, there's a famous rabbinical line that says every line of Genesis can be read in 10 different ways. Any line of the Bible can be read in multiple ways. And because the gods speak in ways that to us are enigmatic, mysterious, multiple, and multi-layered, right? They're greater than us, the gods. Therefore, what they prompt and promise and promote is multiple reading, right? It's the opposite of literalism or fundamentalism. That's actually a betrayal of sacred mythology. The best way of honoring sacred mythology is to invite multiple readings. And that's why Arundhati Roy is not writing sort of a theology of Hindu philosophy. She's writing a novel. And sometimes novels are the best ways of honoring this multiple meaning of our origin stories. So that's the first point, that mythology is actually, in many respects, a permission to narrate in multiple ways in order to honor the inexhaustible nature of meaning that was there from the beginning, however we interpret it. And it really should be interpreted in multiple ways. I mean, with the Enlightenment, with modernity, with the discovery of multiple different cultures, mythologies, the need for interreligious communication and dialogue, that led to a further discovery that the gods speak in many ways, and the many ways require and recommend multiple interpretations, that is, multiple retellings. Let me take it from mythology to a more immediately contemporary example of my compatriot James Joyce, who in his first major novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is basically saying every young man and young woman is creating a portrait of themselves. but a portrait not out of nothing, not ex nihilo, but out of what they have already received. And in the case of Stephen Dedalus, for those of your listeners who know the story, it's a young man who struggles with all of the forces and conditioning influences that have been placed upon him growing up in Dublin at the turn of the 20th century. And he says towards the end of the novel, "I will not serve that in which I no longer believe. My country, my religion, my race, I go forth to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." In other words, I may have been created by my race, meaning he's not talking ethnicity, but my people, my heritage, my tradition, my nation, my state, my community, which was Irish speaking, which was Catholic for the most part in the case of Joyce, which was, an island community on the westernmost point of Europe. But I am not determined or predetermined in any necessary way by that set of inheritances. I can go forth, I repeat, quoting Joyce, to forge in the smithy of my soul. The smithy is where a blacksmith works, turning iron into different shapes, like horseshoes or weapons or whatever, instruments of agriculture and ornamentation. The smithy of the uncreated conscience of my race. There's still a future out there. I am my possibilities. And that's why he goes forth to paint his portrait. But it'll be a portrait painted with colors, shapes, styles, frames, parameters, voices that have been laid down beforehand. Like any artist who comes along, Picasso, he doesn't just invent out of nowhere. He knows the traditions. He knows African art, he knows Greek art, he knows Roman art, he knows medieval religious art in Europe, and so on and so forth. So that's the mix of narrativity. It's a listening and it's a retelling at one and the same time.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a coming together of two different forces. One almost like an archetypal story set that like these are the sets of stories that typically hold true or that are so true to human nature that we naturally come to them, but then the way that they're expressed by these different people or different communities turns out to be, I guess, so delightful in unexpected ways, which is why I'm going to guess, which is why they are so compelling to us, so that the narrative. And the question is it true to say that there are certain narratives that are very seductive to us just by the fact of them being true to human nature? And is it right to think about it in the sense that each time they're told in ways that are so specific to a certain people at a certain time, that they then become specifically very attractive to those people, either in the way they tell the story of themselves to themselves, or the way they sort of think about their collective consciousness, as you told about Daedalus.
Yeah. Well, Daedalus says it all in a way. Daedalus is the surname of Stephen Dedalus, a young Dublin youth growing up at the turn of the 20th century, as I said. But Daedalus is also the name of a Greek hero who invented the labyrinth, and the Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth. And he was an architect like your good self. So Stephen Dedalus is not coming out of nowhere. He's coming from Greek mythology, he's coming from Celtic mythology, European Viking mythology, he's coming from Abrahamic mythology. So in that sense, he's Daedalus. He's a maker, he's an architect, he's a designer of the labyrinth, but he's also somebody who has received that wisdom in many respects from his ancestors, from his culture. So every story, every narrative is a mixture of the familiar and the strange, of the old and the new. And it's getting the right balance that's important. If there's too much of the familiar, then one is into cliche, one is into repeating the in a monological way, the conventional stories, the canonical stories that are, as it were, prescribed by the authority of one's community. If, on the other hand, they're too strange, then nobody's going to recognize them. Nobody's going to say, oh, well, that resonates with me. That's my story. That could be my story, right? And the greatness of any narrative is that one can say, even if it's in a foreign language, foreign culture, foreign characters, oh, that could be me. There but for the grace of God go I, as people said in Shakespeare plays in the Elizabethan age. So, I mean, an example of going too far into the foreign would be a story that is so linguistically or stylistically or epistemologically alien to you that you just can't connect. I can't get it. It's like, oh, that's Chinese to me. That's Greek to me. That's Gaelic to me. I don't get it. Can't speak that language. And sometimes in sci-fi, particularly sci-fi movies, this has been a dilemma for the directors, the screenwriters, that if they create a monster, an extraterrestrial being, that is so unrecognizable to humans that it doesn't pass muster, it doesn't register with them, then the point is lost. They turn off the television, they walk out of the cinema. And this was a problem, for example, with the making of Alien. I'm trying to remember the Ripley Scott, I think it was. When initially the special effects people came up with a monster that was so strange, so deterritorialized and extraterrestrial, that it was no longer terrestrial at all. And they tried it out on audiences, a draft of the film, some of the early rushes, and people just didn't find it frightening because they couldn't connect. So they had to give human-like qualities, anthropomorphic qualities to the monster, a snout, eyes, claws, a tail, certain noises that could be interpreted, even at the limit and with a stretch of the imagination, as human-like. Because if not, then there just wasn't a connection. It was too strange, too unfamiliar, and therefore one couldn't identify with it. So there's that particular balance between the old and the new. And Aristotle called this ability to understand narrative and understand narratively phronesis, practical wisdom. It's not pure abstract wisdom like codes. Sometimes people can't understand mathematics or symbolic logic. It's too alien, it's too abstract, too removed from our everyday lived experience, except for the experts who understand these things. AI sometimes runs that problem. It's available at its most sophisticated to some people, but not to everyone. However, back to Aristotle, he took the example of the architect, again, like your good self, who practices practical wisdom, phronetic wisdom, which Paul Ricoeur translates as a narrative wisdom, in the sense that an architect is somebody who comes along with a blueprint, comes along with a new design, a new way of shaping space, but must do so if it's to work, if the building is actually to be made, if Daedalus's labyrinth is actually to be constructed with a monster, an alien monster at the heart of it. She, the architect, nonetheless must use phronesis, practical wisdom, to say, well, how do I bring this idea, schema, blueprint, plan, mythos, plot, from my mind into the plot of land in which I find myself, into time and space? How do I make the word flesh? How do I make the map material? And that means, says Aristotle, this is in the Nicomachean in Ethics, but also in the Poetics, it means adapting and translating your plan into, which is new, which is innovating, into the circumstances and conditions in which you find yourself, what the existentialists would call your facticity, your situation. In other words, the quality of the soil, the slant of the sun, the particular slope of the hill, the availability or not of moisture and so on, and rock. And out of these material, geological materials, I mean, entities, givens, you then reconfigure them in such a way that novelty can translate itself into and transliterate itself into the real lived world. And it's always a balance between the two. And some architectural projects, utopian projects, are left empty. And I think even doesn't Gaudi have a cathedral in Bilbao or somewhere, I'm maybe getting the names wrong, that is unfinished. There were utopian societies that were created in the past. Some are still, Machu Picchu in Peru. Others in, pre-Columbian times. Even the pyramids, you could argue, that were maybe so new, so utopian that they were unlivable. And, extraterrestrial, out of space architectural sci-fi sometimes creates plots and plans that are simply unrecognizable to us, and nobody wants to live there. Nobody can live there anymore. They're just too far out, so to speak, too unfamiliar, too new to be adapted to our actual embodied lived experience, because we are beings of the flesh. We are humans, meaning we come from humus, the earth, and we need humility, same root, and humor, same root, to fully assume that humanity, that we are of the earth. Adam and Eve were shaped from the earth. In Greek mythology, the human, as Heidegger says in Being and Time, comes from humus, who was shaped by Kura, the god who cared and shaped from the soil the human being. And that's true of all mythologies. Even Adam was called, in Hebrew, translated into the muddy one. In French, glébu, le glébu, the muddy one. And it's that muddiness, earthiness, that terrestrial, autochthonous, carnal, embodied, incarnate nature of our being that narrative has to constantly deal with. Otherwise, it flies off into an excarnate abstraction, which is uninhabitable by human beings. And AI could run the risk of that it proposes a plan, a plot, a code, a universe that is so disincarnate, so excarnate, that we can no longer live there.
Yeah, it becomes its own governor in sorts, yes. Not really too related to us. Well, that discussion on the lines of animation and making things feel uncomfortably familiar is so interesting to me, because in my head it sort of it made me think about why Pinocchio feels really natural, and even though it's a story about a wooden doll, and it's done in this really old-fashioned hand-drawn cartoon way, it feels so much more natural than, for example, the first run of The Incredibles that Pixar was producing, where they couldn't get the hair quite right on people. They couldn't get the body movements to be quite right, and it just felt really, really unnatural. So they had to take it back into the studio, and after what I can only guess is millions and millions of dollars more worth of investment and a lot of time, got those things to feel familiar, and sort of not familiar in a natural way, not in sort of like an obscured
Yes.
odd manner. What the second part of what you were saying just now, which was sort of stories evolving and changing dependent on sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts for a second. Right, on these various retellings and archetypes. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
That's quite all right.
My apologies.
I have something I'd like to say.
Yeah, of course.
Your earlier remark,
yeah,
about the alien becoming too alien, and I was thinking just of so many contemporary films reflect an anxiety and a concern in, the new generations who are very familiar with AI and all that it represents, the cyborg, the cybernetic culture. You get movies like Barbie, huge success, or Ex Machina before that, but countless others where there are beings that are artificially created. Think of Westworld, for example, that did a huge success in terms of a TV series. When I was teaching my philosophy of imagination class in Boston College, 80% of students were giving me their papers on imagination, where is imagination now, etc., in terms of these kind of movies, which reflect an anxiety about a liminal space where the human, as it were, rubs shoulders with the post-human, the surhuman, the more than human, the other than human. And then the question is this person human or not? Barbie being a perfect case in point. And then, the final scene when she kind of declares herself for more humanity and less artificiality. And I won't go into the story of Ex Machina, again, a cyber being that wants to love and be loved. Or her, a voice, a coded voice. So all of these films that really do resonate with people so much, Black Mirror is another kind of TV series, are reflecting this point of almost fascination, if not obsession, certainly preoccupation with liminal beings, that we live in a kind of a liminal space. And it's not that we want to return to the familiar again, although there are movements, reactionary movements, MAGA movements, whatever, make Europe great again, make America great again, make whatever, Ireland, England, Italy, New Zealand great again, meaning that we were better off before. We want to go back to the familiar. We don't want strangers. We don't want immigrants. We don't want new people arriving in and upsetting our codes and customs and traditions. And over and against that, move away from the unfamiliar back to the very familiar. You have a kind of a counter movement, which was modernism, but you also find it in forms of postmodernism that says, no, estrangement is actually a positive quality. When cultures become too familiar, too traditionalist, too reactionary, too, as it were, right wing, whichever way you want to put it, left wing, right wing, yin and yang. And that was called, in the modernist movement, by Brecht, Bertolt Brecht, Entfremdung, Verfremdung, Entfremdung. It was an estrangement, that art should estrange and defamiliarize the viewer from their given certitudes, prejudices, presuppositions, and open them up to new ways of imagining. So again, we're back to the balance between estrangement as a creative, liberating power on the one hand, and then a certain familiarity as an earthiness, going back to who we really are in our embodied given beings on the other hand. And that is a delicate balance. And it's what art is all about, and no doubt architecture and philosophy, which you and I are engaged in as well.
Yeah, it occurs to me, and this is a reflection on the point that you made before as well. You said something along the lines of an artist needs to learn the rules before they can break them. So sort of understand, I guess, the way, and then sort of play with the way things are to achieve that either sense of delight or any other emotion that they go for. And I was listening to a speech by a geneticist recently who was tracking the evolution of different, I guess, races and tracks of humans across Earth, and the intermixing of genes. And what he said is that it can be quite dangerous to pigeonhole yourself to a certain view of what your history is, because your story of yourself and of your people changes depending on the time scale you view it at. So if you look at it over the last maybe couple thousand years, you might think of, in general, countries and genetics the way we think of them today. But you go from 2000 to 10,000 years ago, all of a sudden you're thinking of certain groups of humans that aren't existing anymore. And then you take that to 100,000 years before that, and now you're thinking about humans versus Neanderthals versus other species of, I guess, human-like species. And that just showed me so deeply how not only the time scale, but the context in which you nest your national or your group-like story can affect the way you interpret it so much.
Yeah. That's, another great observation. It reminds me of the importance of narrative as an ability to move between different kinds of time. Let's call it hot time and slow time, or deep time. And deep time, I'm drawing here from Levi-Strauss, who says there's two ways of understanding human history. One is in terms of hot societies, as he calls them, that are moving diachronically, historically, from one moment to the next, and everything is new and everything is different and everything is very variable, versus synchronic time, or deeper time, where everything slows down and we start seeing connections between things. Not that everything is different from everything else, but things are similar to other things. My culture is similar to other cultures. My Celtic Gaelic mythology, actually, if you go back 5,000 years, is very similar in some fundamental structural respects with what's going on in Greek mythology, or Nordic mythology, or Asian mythology, or Aboriginal mythology, etc. And this has given rise to a contemporary narrative of deep time, which is another way of recounting where we came from and who we are, where we're going. And broadly speaking, and this has come up quite recently, there's the idea that we're embarking upon a symbiocene, an age where we collaborate in an interspecies way with other living and non-living beings. And we overcome what is now considered to be the prejudice of the Anthropocene, which really prevailed for maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years, which placed the human, the anthropos, at the center of the universe. And the anthropos, as Plato says in the Cratylus, is the one, the human in other words, anthropos is the one who tropos and looks up, who looks up. In other words, who lets the eye, the optical, predominate over the other senses, because the tactile and touch kept us in touch with the earth, with the horizontal. But now we go vertically up and we look to ideas, we look to abstractions, we look to the super sensible, the ideal, some would say the theological, to explain who we are. And that becomes part of the anthropological universe, the Anthropocene, where we become, in Descartes' famous words, finally, with modernity, the masters and possessors of nature, right? And the Anthropocene itself emerged from what's known as the Holocene, which dates back to sort of 11,000, 12,000 years, the end of the last ice age, and the beginning of what we can now call recorded history, a story we can narrate because we've got signs, we've got runes, we've got, from the third millennium BC on, we've got alphabets, we've got languages, the Phoenician and then the Greek and what have you. So these different languages emerge, and then of course we've architectural runes going back even further, and that's part of an ability to tell the story right back to Lascaux, even 11,000, 12,000 years, but maybe some would say even 20,000 years, where there are prints of humans on walls. But the Holocene was a scene of the whole and the new, where humans are interacting with the non-human world, but in a way that respects the priority and anteriority of nature, of physis, over the anthropos, the human. So yes, we have imprints, but when we have our hand imprints, beside it, we have prints, primitive drawings and etchings and whatnot of animals, of gods, of bisons and deers and trees and so on, of the natural world, the sense that we're immersed in the natural world. And it's only with the Anthropocene, therefore from, the 5,000 years ago at the earliest, but becoming radicalized with modernity, with the emergence of the Copernican revolution in science, but also in philosophy. Kant, following Descartes, announces the Copernican revolution, where from now on, knowledge is not about what we learn from nature, adapting our mind to nature, the old adage being, of traditional epistemology, and in adequatio intellectus ad rem, the adequation, the fitting of the intellect to the world, to reality, to nature. That's reversed. And in modernity, the Anthropocene reaches its apogee, its summit, its fulfillment, for better or for worse, where now the human, the anthropos, the one who looks up and away from nature, away from the tactile, becomes this, as it were, excarnate superman, supervisor, superhuman being of the universe. In Nietzsche, it's the will to power, if you will, brought to its extreme. And the world, nature, becomes a work of art, and we are the masters and possessors and artisans of the universe. It's Daedalus brought to the ultimate extreme, where the universe, nature, becomes a labyrinth of our making. And with pollution, climate change, and capitalism, sometimes it's called, the Anthropocene is called the Capitalocene. This mastery of everything for human measurement and human means leads to the possibility of our own self-extinction. So the Symbiocene becomes the third chapter, if you will. Not that it's diachronically, necessary or inevitable, but it becomes a third possibility where the human and the non-human would learn to, as it were, collaborate and cooperate. And that's another story of interspecies being, interconnectivity, that we find, in the new physics. We find it in microbiology, people like Lynn Margulis, who talks about symbiosis. We live in a symbiotic planet. Now, it was always like that, but we didn't see it like that. We didn't understand it to be primarily a symbiotic relationship between the human and the non-human. As we learn from our basic bacterial origins and how the body works symbiotically, within the body and between the body and the environment, as our interconnection with the world out there works and with other beings. The hand touching the hand, it's reciprocal, it's active and passive. You can't touch without being tangible and tactile. You can see without being seen. You can hear without being heard, but you can't touch without being tangible and tactile, therefore vulnerable, therefore open to what is other than you. That's the Symbiocene. That's symbiosis. It's how microbiology works. It's how the bacterial algal world works. And we are descendants of that. That's part of our humanity, our humus. And symbiosis, the Symbiocene, is a story, a new story, that recounts who we are from the beginning as we've traversed the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And there's a lot going on before the Holocene, but let's just keep it simple. Three parts in the drama, as Aristotle says. The Holocene giving rise, where there's a domination of nature over the human, gives rise, that prevails for 10,000 years. Then gives rise to the Anthropocene, which operates and speeds up as we enter modernity. And then we have the postmodern sort of collapse of the grand narratives of the Anthropocene. The Enlightenment is a blind march towards progress and, liberal capitalism and everything that goes with that, scientific discoveries and AI. And this kind of blind optimism has really come to grief with the recognition that we have this climate crisis. We have the reawakening of martial forces and conflict throughout the world. and war. And so the moment of the symbiocene arises as a recognition and a reconnecting with the story of ourselves as we have been from the beginning, and which we can be again in new ways. Taking what has been good about the Anthropocene, but bringing it into a post-anthropomorphic, post-anthropocentric story. And that's deep time, right? Which takes, 12,000 years and more, and says what has happened during that time. Hegel has a famous phrase. He says, we are what we have become. And the Symbiocene, in a way, is a humility towards what we have become, towards our history, how we began. Nearly all Aboriginal societies and cultures, certainly in North America, but I gather elsewhere, and you may know coming from New Zealand and the the Australasian sort of cultures, all my relations, I've been to ceremonies with the Lakotas, with my brother who works with them in palliative care and healing rites, and they always begin their ceremonies and their sweat lodges with all my relations. This idea, we are interconnected. And in those ceremonies, in the sweat lodges, you begin with the four elements that make up the world. Air, that allows fire to emerge, and the stones, absolutely, primal rocks, are put into the fire, and they generate heat, and you inhale the air and the heat, your body does, and you're kind of reborn in different ways. But the point is that the coming together of the four elements, air, water, because you put water on the burning molten hot rocks, produces then steam, air, that you breathe in, and your body melts basically, and then you are sort of physiologically reborn. But the point is, the phrase running through all that is all my relations, and all my relations go to not everybody in the room that seeks healing and renewal and rebirth, not everybody out there in the country, in the community, in the nation, in the continent, in the world, but it goes back to the beginning of time, and it goes forward to future generations for whom we are responsible. When I say all my relations, it's not just the past, the Holocene, it's also the Symbiocene that can come again as a symbiotic relationship between humans and, in an interspecies way, all other non-human beings and entities, right back to the beginning of time, that is to say, prehistoric geology, those rocks that are in that fire, that element of fire that has been there from the beginning of time. Human civilization begins with the discovery of fire, whether it's Prometheus or whether it's any of the other mythologies. It's always the discovery of fire. And it's fire that transforms nature and air and water into some kind of culture. Nature becomes culture. But we can never forget those four natural elements that make us up as a community and as individuals.
You might find this interesting, but in New Zealand, traditionally, when you go from, let's say back in the day, from your tribe to another tribe, where you're a stranger, you begin by introducing yourself in this thing in a tradition called the pepeha. So you first of all introduce where you're from, and the way you do that is you say the mountain that is the closest to you, or that you consider home. So New Zealand's a collection of volcanoes, so every tribe is typically associated with some significant landmark. And then you talk about the rivers that make up your lands, and you talk about the living creatures that are around your lands. So I thought that was quite a very, very interesting sort of universal connection. And I'm Indian originally, and Hindu by religion. And we have a tradition where every Diwali, which is coming up soon, the whole country gets together and lights candles, and celebrates with light and color. And the tradition is typically for so the story behind Diwali is one of the gods, Ram, his wife is taken away by a demon. And when he goes to rescue her, he slays said demon and brings her back. Him and his brother go on this expedition. And the way it's marked in our culture is we have a big statue of this 10-headed demon, which then someone from the community takes a bow and arrow lit on fire and carries, or rather sets, this massive statue into flame, sort of to signify the rebirth and the purification of that ugly narrative that could have been. So I thought that was very a very interesting connection of our past narratives, and I'd love to know how different the retelling of our past narratives is to the desire to tell the narrative for the future. So you interrelated hot time, cold time, and deep time, and then deep time sort of felt like a much more expansive desire to think about where we had been and where we could go. How do we conceive of that in our minds, and what's the story behind that?
Yeah, good. Well, let me answer two things. That particular question about where do we go with all this, what will the Symbiocene maybe look like as a retrieval of our first primal way of being as symbiotic beings, which we never ceased to be. But that was covered over in hot time, by all these different layers that are moving so quickly, eventually towards almost an excarnation of our beings as AI, cyborgs. One scenario. And then the need to return from the digital to the digital, or combine the digital as a code, an AI code, which makes our computers work and our iPhones and most of our communications. As we know, if there's an electrical, blackout, nobody can communicate anymore. We are so dependent, like prostheses, on our iPhones and our computers, as in this conversation. So that's one very important way of moving towards the future and trying to rethink the future. I tried to tease this out at the end of my recent book, Touch, revitalizing our most important sense. But the digital as AI code is only one sense of the digital. It's the new sense. It's the Anthropocene's ultimate gift to humanity. But it could be a poison gift unless it is recalibrated with and reintegrated into the other sense of the digital, which is the symbiotic. Or you could go back to the Holocene even for this, but the symbiosis brings together the best of the Holocene and the Anthropocene, the best of what nature has given to us, and the best Holocene, and the best of what we have given to nature, Anthropocene. Because it's not all bad. We built extraordinary things. We've made trains, we made planes, we made computers. This is not all bad. We want to carry the best of that with us into the next phase, if there is one, we hope there is, of our human existence. But this time, human in relation to the non-human. It has to be, ultimately, all other living and non-living beings in a symbiotic planetary existence. So that requires us to return to the first sense of the digital, which is our fingers and our toes, our digits. The fact that we began as tactile digital beings on this earth. We were four-legged, we were quadrupeds. Before we reached up as anthropos, and looked at the stars, and looked at the transcendental ideas, and looked at a suprasensible, immutable, divine world, disincarnate world, up there, out there, pure ideas, pure forms. Before that, and I'm not saying that was a bad move, the Platonic, metaphysical move. It gave rise to contemporary science and technology. It gave rise to the Anthropocene. We couldn't have that without that move away from the earth, nature, towards culture, ideas. But there has to be a proper balance. And so the further we go in terms of digital codedness, the more urgently we need to reconnect with that which we've never lost completely, fortunately, which is our bodies, our hands and our feet, our digital being in the world. And that's our identity primarily. In AI, we can construct identities. We can have profiles. We can have, websites. We can have, all kinds of social media personas. But the one thing we can't make up is our fingerprints. And that's why they're on passports and ID cards, because that's unique to each human being. That digital, given, carnal essence, if you will. I'm not an essentialist, but it's a way of, as it were, curbing relativism. You are just who you make yourself up to be. And we have that freedom in social media to create profiles and all kinds of ultra selves, hyper selves, sub selves, altered selves. But our hands and our feet are there. And that's what we're born with. And that is our earthiness, our humility, our humor, and our humanity. And that's where we touch and are touched. Right? And we saw this during COVID, when people weren't allowed to touch each other. They realized there was a touch hunger, that people craved to be with other people, with other living beings. If they couldn't be with humans, they were with animals. Everybody was out trying to buy a dog or a cat as a substitute tactile being, because one of the greatest tragedies during that time was people separate from their families and friends, particularly in the initial phases, and they were dying alone and they were reaching out to be touched. The first thing that happens to us when we're born is we are touched, and we reach out to touch. And the last thing, that's what the infant does, and the last thing people do when they're dying is they reach out to be touched and to touch. And you would see the nurses and the doctors and the caretakers doing their best. There was nothing they could do medically anymore, pharmaceutically, whatever. But what they could do is hold the hand of the shoulder or the head of the person who was dying. And that touch hunger is absolutely fundamental. And a lot of the depression in the young generations now, and the paralysis and the paranoia and the sense of unease is this sense of being disincarnate, excarnate, coded beings in terms of the digital as code that is removed from the digital as carnal. And what I'm basically arguing is, and comes back to your last question, what do we do for the future? How do we carry our past into our future? Narratively, we tell the story of the two ways we are digital. The old from the beginning of time, our hands and our feet, our bodies, our embodiedness, our carnality, and then our codedness. We are cyber, we are carnal, and one cannot exist without the other. I just want to say one quick thing before I leave this point, and that is your invocation, volcanic rocks in your own experience, where whatever one Aboriginal people meets another, and the first thing they do is they tell the story of their place, not just their time, because we're into slow time, we're into deep time here. What Lévi-Strauss called the pensée sauvage, this universal thought that we all share in. Basically, what we all share is we all came from a place. Now, we can differ exponentially in terms of time, and traveling in time through imagination, through digital technology, whatever, through the mind. But we all come from a place, and we all come from a place where there was a river or a hill or a mountain or a well or a tree. And in my culture, the Gaelic culture, there's a word for that. It's called din shachas, and it's telling the story of your place. And like your fingerprints, it's what is most unique about you. But it's what also translates to other people, because they came from different places where there was a river, where there was a mountain, where there was a rock, where there was, etc. And sometimes the older the better, volcanic rocks. I forgot to mention that those primal, pre-original Aboriginal rocks that were put into the sweat lodges by the Lakotas in their healing ceremonies were volcanic rocks, right back to the beginning of time. So that's very important, to the reintroduction of carnal embeddedness in space, as well as our belongingness to time. Because I would say with modernity, time ran away with us and we ran away with time. And we forgot taking turns with space, taking turns with the earth. We ran towards the sky. And, the sky's the limit. But it is actually ultimately a limit. And what goes up must come down. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, as Joni Mitchell says. And what we lost in COVID and what we're losing with the climate emergency and the increased immaterializing, deterritorializing, excarnating of our beings in the world is that sense of being in touch with ourselves and with each other as tactile, carnal, embodied, embedded beings. That's our spatiality. That's our din shachas. That's the story of the mountain, the lake, the river, the stream, the field that we came from. You might say that's difficult in cities, but even cities have streets, and the streets have names, and the names have their own memories. I mean, cityscapes are other ways of carrying memory. They're not landscapes, they're not seascapes, but cityscapes too have a narrative, and they are spatial. And architecture knows this better than any other art or practice, that to create a habitable space, and we're talking now as we face into the future, how do we render the earth habitable again? We need to be able to reconfigure space and time such that we can dwell again on this earth and with this earth. As I put it in my project, the Guestbook Project, it's an international non-profit for bringing young people in divided communities together, but we're working particularly at the moment on eco-hospitality, narrative hospitality as eco-hospitality. And that's about how do we dwell again on the earth as symbiotic, carnal, embedded, embodied beings.
Can you pull yourself out of the hole of being disenchanted or disincarnated by just deciding that you're not? Or is this a story that needs to be a lot more visceral and communal based? Is it an individual endeavor, or is it the opposite?
I would say it's both, but it begins, you might say, first and foremost as a precondition to just opening your senses again, reconnecting with the world. I mean, every sort of awakening practice, meditation practice, yoga practice, centering practice, there's 1,000 words for this now, isn't there? Coming back to yourself practice. Sometimes it can be a bit new agey, but it speaks a need that people have to reconnect. Some people do that by going to the pub and having a pint of Guinness. Other people go to a rock concert. Other people go for a walk in nature. I mean, there's different ways of doing it to get back in touch with your being in the world with others, your tactile and tangible being. And I think it's as simple as just becoming aware of touching and being touched, taking your hand and placing it on the desk, on the sheet of paper, on the plant, on whatever, your iPhone, touching. And then in relation to living beings, I mean, plants included, but more particularly animals and humans, when you touch, you are aware that you are being touched at the same time. And that's called vulnerability, susceptibility, sensibility. To be sensible is to be intelligible because you are back in touch with your senses. And that's just a question of opening your eyes. And more importantly, opening your hands. The handshake is the beginning of civilization. It's reaching out to the other and receiving their hand in your hand in turn. It's how you begin your life. It's how you end your life. And it's the best thing you can do during your life is to actually reach out to touch and be touched. And that's there all the time, all the time. I mean, in all the wisdom traditions, there's the sacred moment of, retreat or return or walkabout or recollection, where you sit still, as Saint Benedict said in the Rule of Benedict, the beginning of Western monasticism, sit still and know God. It's as simple as that. Just sit still, open your senses. Ausculta was the opening word of the Rule of Benedict, great spiritual Western tradition, and we know that Hindu, Buddhist, Asian traditions are Aboriginal or even richer, or certainly as rich in this regard. But ausculta, listen. was the first word. Open your senses. Open your senses. Become tactile. If you think about it, what's the origin of the word for wisdom? Sapientia, coming from sapere, to taste. Savourer, sapere, to taste. Or flair, to smell, the olfactory. Or tact, to touch, to be tactile, right? And with sight, if it can link up again with touch, sight becomes insight. It becomes a double sensation where when you see something, you're also seen by it. As a child growing up, my mother used to sing with us as we went to the sea, my siblings and I, we'd walk towards the sea, we'd say, I see the sea and the sea sees me. We see the sea and the sea sees us. I see the trees and the trees see me. There's that sense of double sensation. That can happen in a flash by just opening your senses. It's there from the beginning. Sit still, open your senses, or as the Hindus say, the old Vedic wisdom, breathe deep. And that inhalation and exhalation, you're exchanged symbiotically with the oxygen that is provided to you by the phytoplanktons in the sea, by the trees and the vegetation in the universe, that gives you oxygen and then takes your carbon and converts it into oxygen. So there's this symbiotic relationship of inhaling, exhaling. You are breathing in the trees and they are breathing in you, so to speak. And one is turning oxygen into carbon and vice versa. That's how we are. That's how we exist. So where do you begin? That's where you begin, by breathing, by opening your senses. And from there, of course, that's not enough. We do need to connect with other human beings, other species too, but other human beings in terms of reconfiguring our future possibilities such that we provide space and time for people to become incarnate again, to become, as I call it, anacarnation, meaning again, forward, back and forward. Anna, the Greek word, is a great word from that point of view, in time and space, to become anacarnate again. Anacarnation is that ability to take a step back to move forward, to realize we've always been symbiotic beings. Now let's co-create together, collaboratively, as fellow humans, humans together, but also humans working with non-human living beings and non-living beings towards the possibility of the symbiosis. Because it doesn't have to come. It's not inevitable. We could destroy this universe. Other things will go on other universe and other planets, but we do have the freedom to, and the responsibility and the will to intervene with our imaginations to help co-design the possibilities of dwelling again on this earth symbiotically. The two digital powers of our being, the cyber and the carnal, working together, working as a symbiosis.
Where does your love for learning come from over the vast career that you've had, and what's that story about learning and teaching to you?
Yeah, well, it's a very simple one, really. I was very fortunate to have wonderful teachers. I was unfortunate to have some terrible teachers, but my love of learning came from the earliest, the earliest of times. As a young, 5-6-year-old, I just had wonderful teachers. I mean, I suppose beginning with my parents, my uncles and my aunts, but then more formally, as I went to schools, growing up in Ireland in the 1950s, 60s, I happened to have 3 or 4 exceptional teachers who taught me the Irish language, who taught me the beauties of a certain kind of way of practicing religion and spirituality, spiritual wisdom, who taught me literature in French, in English. Practically every poem I still know, I learned between the ages of 8 and 18. That formative stage where I was lucky to have really, really wonderful teachers who cared, who listened. And I'm very grateful to them. And then that led at university level to other great teachers. I mean, I was fortunate to have in France Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, Derrida, Foucault, so many others. In North America, Charles Taylor, who I did my graduate work with before I moved to Paul Ricoeur, and so on. I mean, I was very, very fortunate to have so many teachers. And some of my books are books of dialogues, and they're with my teachers. They're with wise elders, wise colleagues. And I've always learned so much from other people and tended to work communally and collectively in that sense, symbiotically perhaps. I mean, obviously one does the work of writing and reading on one's own, but the spark for me, the energy comes from this kind of thing, talking to another human being. That gives me energy. If I get up and I'm on my own for the day, I'm not going to have these kinds of thoughts. And when I talk to you or anybody in a podcast or anybody, last week here in Ireland, I've had 2 or 3 public conversations with poets and writers and politicians. And each one I learned something. I learned from the conversation. Something new emerges symbiotically out of the give and take. I was talking about the inhalation and exhalation of being between trees and humans, but it's true between human beings. The logos is the word between. And I would say that's what keeps me going. And why, even though I could retire now, I'm keen to continue for as long as my mind holds together, because of the connection with students and colleagues in the classroom, in the seminar room. I find that absolutely vital. So there comes a point where, you pass on the baton to others who can teach better than you can. But knowing what I learned from and received from my teachers that brought me into academia and spurred me on, I like to think that I could be, even in a small way, such a teacher to students, and that they can remain as students, teachers for me to the bitter end.
Thank you very much, Professor Kearney. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.
Me too. Thank you, Yash.